I'm talking about Sweden, of violent clashes.
Gang crime. Sweden.
In these videos, we see gangs of migrants blowing up cars and smashing up shops. This is a difficult time for Sweden. Sweden has never experienced anything like this. Only less than 10 years ago, Sweden had the lowest rate of firearms crime in Europe. Belgium, France and Britain have always been considered the most criminal countries in Europe. London and Marseille were the capitals of the criminal world. But today Sweden has entered the top 3, pushing England aside. Today they are in 3rd place. There are about 30 times more armed attacks in Stockholm than in London. The country has been engulfed by a war between gangster groups, which is waged exclusively by immigrants. The social orientation of the state and democratic asylum laws have made Sweden a point of attraction for migrants. And 2015 was a record year. Almost half of the migrants are unemployed, and almost all live on welfare. They live mainly in poor suburbs and are not full-fledged members of Swedish society. It is these people who are recruited into gangs by criminal groups. The average GDP per capita is $60,000, making Sweden one of the richest countries on earth. The life expectancy is 83 years, and the country has one of the best health and education systems in the world. But when it comes to emigration and how well migrants integrate into Swedish society, Sweden shows very deplorable results. In the 1870s, the Swedish economy lagged far behind other countries in Northern and Western Europe, and their average GDP per capita was half that of the United Kingdom. Most of the country's population was engaged in agriculture, and this is an extremely difficult task in a subarctic climate. The country has developed a strict labor discipline, where a special place was given to intensive work, personal responsibility, and family values. When industrialization began in the world, Sweden became the fastest growing economy on earth. The Swedes were reliable, hardworking, and responsible. They remained neutral during both world wars and created a much more moderate version of the social-oriented state than today's one. Sweden's path to prosperity was characterized by free market policies and limited government intervention. It was only in the 1960s that more radical reforms took place in their social system. The concept of the folkhemmet has become very popular. She describes Sweden as a family in which citizens have to take care of each other like brothers and sisters. This philosophy partly explains why Sweden accepts refugees. Today, their welfare state provides citizens, both Swedes and expats, with enormous social assistance. Upon the birth or adoption of a child, each parent is entitled to 240 days of parental leave. Married couples of pensioners receive payments that are almost equal to their earnings before retirement. Healthcare and education are mostly free and among the best in the world. The state takes great care, but it requires financing by levying taxes. In the 1950s, the income tax was 21%. Today, the average Swede pays around 50%. But how do all these changes affect the economy? To do this, you need to analyze the country's GDP. Most of the toughest reforms were adopted between 1968 and 1975. The country had a hard time in the 1980s, as it did in the 1990s. In 1975, Sweden was ranked 4th in the list of the richest countries, and in 1993 it was already the 14th. The employment rate has not increased much. In 2014, it was only slightly higher than 3 decades earlier. Social inequality in 2013 was almost the same as in 1950. Nevertheless, by the time the new government came, Sweden was rich and promising. Residents regarded their country as a family and as a society where everyone gets along with each other and where everyone is equal. But this principle began to apply to refugees as well. In 1987, 3% of Sweden's population were immigrants from countries outside the EU. In 2013, this figure was already 12%. And when these migrants came to Sweden, something curious happened. One study found that a group of migrants who fled Iraq in the 1980s and 1990s, where Saddam Hussein was in power, were 2.5 times more likely to receive higher education than native Swedes. But once they were in Sweden, only 18% of them found work. Why aren't they working? The Swedish strategy for dealing with immigrants was to distribute them throughout the country. This was done to reduce the burden on large cities, but the authorities often neglected local economic conditions. In addition, about half of the jobs in Sweden are filled by acquaintance, which is difficult if a person does not speak the local language and does not have useful connections. Nevertheless, all this time, the welfare state has been providing for the basic needs and requirements of such migrants. But in the 2000s, immigration policy changed. More and more migrants began to come to the country due to the humanitarian crisis. In 2015, this process reached its peak. In just 1 year, Sweden has accepted as many as 160,000 refugees. Most of them came from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, fleeing military conflicts at home. And in 2011, this led to the fact that 20% of the Swedish population had a foreign origin, Many found themselves in poor suburbs. They did not interact well with society and did not feel part of it. Many of the migrants lived in poverty and were completely dependent on government benefits. This has become not only a burden for the country, but also an increase in criminal activity. Recent outbreaks of violence have occurred between criminal gangs led by the second generation of immigrants. They recruit teenagers from poor neighborhoods, they even infiltrated the government and even political parties, where they began to make money from fraud and other illegal activities. It's hard to say for sure, but according to one study, criminal organizations annually profit from such illegal activities in the amount of about $500 million. More than half of the Swedish residents who received harsh prison sentences are first-generation immigrants, and 45% of the Swedish unemployed were born outside Europe. This community has become a heavy burden for the country. Throughout the 2010s, the nationalist Sweden Democrats Party unsuccessfully called for restrictions on immigration. It was a small political party, but partly due to the migration crisis, they are now one of the leading political forces in Sweden. The current Prime Minister was moving away from tradition, supporting tax cuts, free market policies, and economic liberalism. He works closely with the Sweden Democrats. His right-wing coalition believes that the growing confrontation between gang groups is directly related to the immigration policy of the past years. Indeed, government policies aimed at the socialization of migrants are partly to blame, and the deterioration of the situation has occurred in a system that has probably gone too far in accepting refugees. The idea of a complete return to capitalist society does not find widespread support, but the policy of the Swedish government indicates that such changes are needed. They are carrying out reforms, complicating migration to Sweden, and those who have already found themselves in Sweden are trying to actively introduce into Swedish society. For children born to two parents of different nationalities, kindergarten attendance is now mandatory. This is how they are helped to learn Swedish. Will Sweden be able to cope with the migration crisis? We still have to find out the answers.